Okay, folks, today we're going to talk about the Battle of First Manassas. In fact, let me get my little picture out of the way. Um, Maybe right there. So, this is the first battle, the first major battle, we'll say, of the Civil War, and it takes place right in our backyard here, Manassas not being very far from where any of you live. Here's a picture of Manassas today. Uh, a lot of you have been there. That's Old Town. Here's a picture of Manassas. I'm not sure if it was pre-Civil War or post-Civil War, but certainly before they paved the street and had any cars. And it would have looked very similar to that back in the day. So you can sort of actually see some of the same buildings if you look carefully, which is cool. So at the time, Manassas was a railroad hub, and it had a line that went to Culpeper, Front Royal, and the one that went down to Culpeper then would go to Orange and then over to Richmond. So it was kind of an important railroad hub. The South sent its Army of the Potomac, that's what they called it up, about 20,000 men. And the general, Beauregard, decided to defend Manassas as it was the most important juncture point. He assumed the place where the Union Army would come to attack him. However, the Union had sort of a different plan in mind at the beginning of the war. The man who was most responsible for Union strategies, this old guy right here, General Winfield Scott, he was, I think, in his 70s at the time that the war started. He had been probably the most famous general in American history outside of the Revolutionary War at that point. He'd been involved in the War of 1812. He'd been involved in the Seminole War. He led the army in the Mexican War. He had a lot of experience, and he was a relatively good general. And he came up with this plan, which ultimately would be the plan that would be successful. It was called the Anaconda Plan, named after the anaconda, that giant snake that lives in South America. And so the idea behind the Anaconda Plan was that the United States had a big navy and the Confederacy did not. And the United States Navy would blockade, you can see it going all the way around the coast, the Confederate states, and they wouldn't be able to trade, export or import with anybody, and they would have to be self-sustaining. At the same time, an army from the north supported by gunboats and an invasion from the south supported by the Navy and gunboats would take the Mississippi River, the entire line of the Mississippi River, and essentially cut the Confederacy in half. Scott expected this plan to be effective in a year or two. They were going to, enormously increase the size of the Union Army and then blockade the South. And part of the reasoning behind this plan is that Scott and Lincoln and a number of others didn't really feel like the South wanted secession. They thought it was a few radicals who had sort of caught the rest of the South up in this secession fever, and that given time and hardship, people would realize that they liked being in the Union better than they liked being in the Confederacy, and then they would sort of vote to rejoin the Union, and this whole thing would just go away. At least that was Scott's plan, and it seems like a sound plan, and a lot of its elements were implemented as the war would go on, but it would obviously last longer than he thought and have a lot more battles. The problem was public opinion. There was sort of at the time this fascination with this guy Napoleon from from France, and there was this sort of myth out there that wars were won with the outcome of one great battle, and this goes back to a really famous European battle called Waterloo, in which Napoleon was defeated by the Duke of Wellington, and the situation in Europe sort of righted itself, and so there was this belief that if battle were joined, whoever won the first battle would just win the war, and the war would be over, and that would be that, which is sort of laughable in in retrospect. But the reality is that they sort of believe that, and so there was this focus on tactics, on having Waterloo became sort of a metaphor for a successful battle. They were going to have their Waterloo. They were going to defeat the South, the North was, and the South would just crumple and the war would be over. And the South were thinking the same thing. We'll just defeat the North in one big battle and then this whole war will be over. So there wasn't really any kind of a focus on logistics or long-term planning or anything like that going into the Battle of First Manassas. So this one great battle myth created sort of a battle fervor on both sides. Both sides just wanted to get into it. They wanted to have this fight. They wanted it to be done so they could sort of get back to business. And this call started to get being taken up, especially by Boston. It's always Boston. I don't know why. Boston newspapers, which started printing a slogan "On to Richmond" on a lot of their um, papers, and the slogan was inflammatory, and it was picked up by all of these other newspapers, and it started being printed all over the North. Basically, the North were advocating, the population was advocating a huge public opinion slide that we should all just, get together and march south and take Richmond and end this thing. And so this put a lot of pressure on Lincoln as a new president. Additionally, if you recall, Lincoln had asked for 100 or 75,000 volunteers. He got 100,000 volunteers, but he signed them all up for 90-day enlistments, and that was in April. And now we're getting to July. At the end of July, those 90 days are up. So his army is only signed on until the end of July, and he has to use it or he's going to lose it. And so these sort of three things, the myth of the one great battle, the on to Richmond slogan, and the ending enlistments basically force Lincoln's hand, and he decides that he has to launch an invasion of the South before things turn against him, before the political climate gets too tough. So he gets his army ready, his Army of Northern Virginia, as he calls it, and puts it together. So your main players in this, I want to go over the generals really quickly so you can sort of put a face and a name with them. The Union general is Major General Irvin McDowell. He's in charge of 35,000 men. You can see him there. And actually, just a point here. The entire Union Army prior to this was 15,000 men. So McDowell is in charge of a group more than twice the size of any group an American general has ever commanded. And this is complicated because even Winfield Scott, that old guy up top, he never commanded more than 15,000 men. That was the height of his command. So this guy has got to command a much bigger army than anyone in America has ever commanded before. He also got his position sort of through politics rather than through ability, which is, there's going to be this distinction between political generals and true generals. Now McDowell did have military experience. He fought in the Mexican War, but his rank in the military was a major. And then he was appointed directly to major general, largely through his influence with Scott and through various other politicians. And so he became the leader of the whole army. But remember that his real experience is as a major. And if you look at the ranks in the military, it goes lieutenant, captain, major, lieutenant colonel, and then there's a whole series of various generals, brigadier general, and regular general before you even get to major general. So he skipped a ton of ranks and moved up. He did teach tactics at a military academy for a while. So clearly, he had some aptitude. But this is a huge appointment for him. And, he's put out there. The other Union general was a guy named Robert Patterson. He was very old at the time, as old as Scott almost. He had 18,000 men, and he was in charge of the Pennsylvania regiment that was based at Harper's Ferry. Patterson's men were at Harper's Ferry, and McDowell's men were in Washington. And so he is going to be assigned a really important role. He's got to march down into the Shenandoah Valley and keep the army of the Shenandoah Valley pinned down so that they can't join the Confederate Army and even the odds. And so that's what he's assigned to do. The Confederate Army is commanded by this guy, P.G.T. Beauregard. He's from Louisiana, and he is famous because he's the guy who started the war, if you want to call it that. He's the guy who led the assault on Fort Sumter. And so he is sort of a famous guy. He's a real general. He earned his place. So did Patterson. Patterson fought in the Mexican War, and he's a real general as well. So Beauregard is a true general. He went to West Point. He graduated, and he is in charge of 20,000 men, a significantly smaller force than the Union force, and therefore a defensive force. He's been ordered by Jefferson Davis to defend Northern Virginia, and he selected Manassas Junction as his base of operations and the place where he's going to fight. The Army of the Shenandoah, I mentioned them just a minute ago, was commanded by a guy named General Joseph Johnston. He is the guy with the most military experience on the ground. He was a general in the United States Army. He fought in a number of Indian wars and the Mexican War, and he graduated in the same year that Robert E. Lee graduated, so they're equal in age and experience. So Johnson has 12,000 men. It's the Army of the Shenandoah, and he's based up in Winchester, and he's sitting up there waiting for Patterson's army to invade at the outset of this battle. So here's a map that shows sort of the dispositions. You can see Patterson up there in the corner facing off against Johnson, and you can see McDowell in Washington and Beauregard in Manassas, sort of sitting next to each other. It'll show you a little bit of how the deployments go here. In fact, let me leave you on this map for a second so we can talk about some of these things. I'll put myself in an empty spot. You can see the rail lines on here and stuff like that. It's kind of nice. So Patterson's job was to keep Johnson in Winchester, and McDowell had to take his troops and attack Beauregard in Manassas and take Manassas. So McDowell crossed the Potomac with his army and marched on Centerville. He ended up taking Centerville very quickly, very easily. There was no real fight there. And Beauregard set up his armies at all of the fords of Bull Run. Actually, pause. One of the interesting things about this battle is that the North called it the Battle of Bull Run, and the South called it the Battle of First Manassas. And there's sort of two naming conventions at play here, and I think that it's worth noting. The North tended to name battles after whatever waterway they were near, and so you'd have battles of this creek or that creek or this river or that river or this bay or whatever. Whereas the South named battles for towns, whatever town it was near, and whoever won the battle ended up usually having sort of the name of the battle. And I think that's sort of the way that you'll see it if you go to historic battlegrounds and places like that. I've got this light behind me that's killing me. There's a window behind me over there. Whatever. Anyway, so Beauregard set up his. So the North calls this the Battle of Bull Run, but the South calls it the Battle of Manassas. And you'll just when you learn more about Civil War battles and you start looking into it, you'll see that there's these two different naming conventions, and it doesn't really matter. I just think it's interesting. But Beauregard set up his forces at all the fords and bridges to the river. They burned the railroad bridge you can see going across there into Manassas. That one's gone, so you can't get through there. There's a stone bridge on the left where the road goes through, and there's a bunch of fords where you could cross an army. And he breaks his divisions up and places them at all the fords to stop the Union Army from crossing. And they're all defensible. It'll be very difficult for the Union Army to cross. And so McDowell stops his troops on the other side of the river and starts looking for some new fords. But one of the problems is McDowell doesn't have any maps, and he can't see where the fords are on a map, and nothing is accurate. And so he has to get some surveyors to go out and look for these fords, but the Confederate has cavalry, and they chase the surveyors off, and so it takes a long time. Meanwhile, Beauregard is concerned that McDowell has so many more men than he does, almost twice his size, and so he needs to get Johnson over from Winchester to his battlefield. And so he writes to Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, asking him to order Johnson to come over, and he does. This is pretty interesting because it all happens over telegraph. Up to this point in the war, these kinds of things couldn't happen as instantaneously because I don't want to copy this picture. You're killing me. Anyway, no. Hopefully that doesn't screw things up. I don't know why that just happened. I just want that open. Hopefully it's not as bad as it seems, but we'll roll back down there. I don't know why again, new technology. I'm hoping this time we don't have that issue where it's vertical instead of horizontal. I'm doing my best to avoid that. Anyway, Beauregard asked Davis for Johnson to come. He telegraphs Johnson, and Johnson knows that Patterson is trying to keep him there. And so Johnson he gets this guy Jeb Stuart, who's his cavalry commander, to put up a ruse that his army's still in Winchester. Stuart's riding back and forth and camping men here and camping men there and making all kinds of noise and doing the kinds of things that makes it look like the army's still there. And Johnson marches down through Ashby's Gap to Piedmont Station, jumps on a train, and heads over to Manassas. And so he ends up using technology that hasn't been used in a major battle before. to bring his army there. He gets the information faster than anybody would expect him to get it via telegraph, and then he's able to move his army to Manassas faster than anyone expects him to, because you'd think you'd be marching that distance. So Patterson fails to keep the Shenandoah army in the Shenandoah, and that evens the odds. If you look at the numbers, Beauregard had 20,000 and McDowell had 35,000 and Johnson had 12,000. So now we're at 32,000 to 35,000. And with Holmes coming up from Aquia Landing, the two armies are essentially identical. So the South uses technology to bring people there. But then we have all kinds of problems. And I just wanted to talk about those problems because this isn't going to be a typical war. Normally in a war, you have lots of trained soldiers, you have professional armies, and this is not that. First off, there's a lack of trained officers. We talked a little bit about true generals versus political generals. Most of the generals on the battlefield, most of the captains and majors, remember the United States Army was 15,000 men. The officer corps was designed for 15,000 men. This is a battle with 60,000 men. So the vast majority of officers had never fought before. Zero battle experience. They were prominent people in their town who were appointed based on their, wealth or political clout. And so these officers don't have any real skills. And so there's, especially early in the war, there's this distinction between true generals and political generals. And some of the political generals end up being very good generals, but the majority of them do not. They don't have the necessary experience, and the true generals are able to lead circles around them. The trained ones, the ones who have battle experience and who went through military academies. Also, the armies don't have the infrastructure that you would expect an army to have. There's a lack of scouts, and the kind of, they're pretty much hiring individuals, and they're not well trained, and they don't know what to look for, and it's hard to get information. They end up using cavalry regiments primarily as scout regiments. Also, McDowell had no good maps of the area, so he sort of went into it blind. He didn't know where the fords were in the river. He didn't know which roads were good roads and which roads were old roads on his map, and didn't connect. And so there was a lot of confusion there. There was a lack of logistical support. Officers usually had a whole logistical system set up where they could send messages out and receive messages, and people who would handle all the various paperwork and all, and that didn't exist. Most of the people who did that in the Army had been promoted to officers because they needed the officers, and so there was no one to fill that gap, and so there was a complete lack of logistical support, in terms of providing them with food and resupplying ammunition and all that kind of stuff. There was a lack of field hospitals. Everybody thought the battle would be just one battle and would be over. And so, there weren't very many nurses. There weren't very many doctors, and there weren't very many ambulances. And almost all of it stayed in Washington and was unavailable to take wounded soldiers off the battlefield. So all these things were pretty terrible. And then we can get to the soldiers themselves. All of the soldiers for both sides. In fact, famously, when Lincoln ordered McDowell to attack, McDowell was like, my men aren't ready. I can't launch an attack right now. And I think Lincoln's response was, true, our soldiers are green, but theirs are green also. We are all green together, which I think is an interesting sort of a statement. But the soldiers were untrained. They were undisciplined. Remember, they had 90-day enlistments, and those 90 days were almost up. So, they were enlisted, formed into units, marched south, and they had maybe a month of training, all told. And so they didn't have the military discipline. They didn't have the military training, and they'd never been tested in combat before. And so the fact that both armies are the same sounds nice. Lincoln's like, hey, they're as untrained as we are. But an untrained army on both sides favors the defense. Defense doesn't have to march as far. They don't have to get their courage up to launch an attack. They just have to sit there and defend themselves. And so this definitely favors the South throughout the battle. Also, it was incredibly hot in July in Northern Virginia, and the Northern Army was all from places like Minnesota and Michigan and Massachusetts and Maine, and they weren't used to the heat. To add more fuel to that fire, the North did not have the supplies of cotton that the South had, and the South wasn't going to sell the North their cotton, and so the Northern uniforms were almost entirely made of wool, which is a very hot uniform in a hot environment where the South had cotton uniforms, and the uniforms actually ended up favoring the South in this way too. Um, Also, this is a great sort of anecdote. Apparently, it was a great year for blackberries, and so there were blackberries, big, juicy, delicious blackberries all over the place. And the Union Army lacked so much discipline that a lot of the soldiers on the march would get hungry and they just wander off into the blackberry bushes and start eating the blackberries and then try and catch up with their units. And so a lot of the units arrived on the battlefield incredibly late because of the foraging and the blackberry picking that was going on. But also they would arrive at half strength or less because of the heat, because these undisciplined soldiers were like, oh, I'm just too tired, I've got to take a break, and all of these kinds of things. And so even though you look at the unit size of the Northern Army, not all of those guys were getting into the field uh, because of lack of discipline, and they were getting into the field a lot slower than they were supposed to. Then we have this complication of uniform inconsistencies. We talk about the blue and the gray as the traditional uniforms of the North and South, and that was definitely true by the end of the war, although the South they were so poor that sometimes their units didn't really get uniformed, and some of the uniform dyes, like the big uniform dyes that they used to dye their uniforms gray, faded to like a butternut squash color over time, and so a number of Southern units towards the end of the war had like these butternut squash colored uniforms. But that wasn't the case in the first battle. One of the ways that generally militia units were distinguished from traditional line army units was that line army units wore blue, and that militias had various different colors. Some had lighter shades of blue that were almost like gray. Some had gray. That was the primary color of militia units. And some had sort of crazy outlandish outfits. And so, there were northern units in gray, particularly one from New York and one from Maine. They were both involved in the fighting. And this caused confusion because people didn't know which side was which. There were also northern units in red. There was like a Minnesota unit in red and a New York unit in red, which is weird, but they were militia units that had been called up and mustered into service. And the southern units had some blue units as well, particularly the Maryland Guard, which was, Maryland is in the Union side, but there were a number of Marylanders who volunteered for service and were fighting on the southern side, and they formed the Maryland Guard, and they were blue as well. And then southern officers, especially those who had been in the military prior to the secession of their states, they still had their old military uniforms, and they're all wearing blue. And then to top all of this off, there was no wind on the day of the battle. And so the flags of the various units and the country flags, whether it's the Confederate flag or the United States flag, they all hung limp and you couldn't tell. And the Confederate flag, if you notice, is red, white, and blue, just like the United States flag is. And so if they're hanging limp on a pole and it's smoky outside, also there was no wind to blow the smoke away, you couldn't really tell your friend from your foe very well, and this caused a lot of confusion on the battlefield. Pause. We're going to do something fun here. I just want to look at the most interesting combat units from both sides. I think I'm going to try and do this in every battle just for fun. The most interesting combat unit on the northern side was the 5th New York Zouaves. A Zouave is a French military unit in the Foreign Legion that was really famous, and they, because they were in the Foreign Legion, they wore sort of outlandish faux Eastern style uniforms. And it was all the rage to have units of Zouaves in your militia. And so the 5th New York Zouaves were called the Fire Zouaves. And you can see their picture here with their parachute pants and red colors and little turbans and all that kind of stuff. They were called the Fire Zouaves because the unit was composed primarily of New York firefighters, which I think is interesting. But they were very flamboyant and they fought in the battle. They were actually routed in the battle during an attack and ran away. But, look at them. They're pretty cool. And there was actually in the South, on the southern side, there was a unit of Zouaves called the Louisiana Zouaves that looked almost identical to these guys in every way. So Zouaves did not last. You didn't see a lot of Zouaves throughout the rest of the war, but I think that was interesting. The South, their most interesting group was a group called the Hampton Legion. It was from South Carolina. It was 600 men. They actually played a pivotal role in the battle. But what's interesting about them, I think, is that the South had this new military unit that was called a legion. And as opposed to other units, which were infantry or cavalry or artillery, the legion was all three. It was a military unit that they had at the start of the war. They organized a number of them, but by the end of the war, they'd all ceased to be. It wasn't a very functional unit to spread your cannons and your infantry and your cavalry out. They had a much greater impact when they were all gathered together. But the Hampton Legion was funded essentially by one man, a man whose last name was Hampton from South Carolina, who was an enormously wealthy slave owner, and he spent his ton of money outfitting, equipping, and training a group of soldiers called the Legion, and they had some of the fanciest uniforms on the battlefield and some of the best equipment. And they arrived at the Henry House just in time to help repulse an attack. Unfortunately, they didn't fight against the Zouaves. That would have been a pretty cool uniform showdown. So let's tell the story of the battle now that you've got enough information to go on. And hopefully we can do this relatively quickly. And I'm not gonna go over this whole thing. Just this illustration will help you sort of see some of the things that I'm talking about. So to start out, the battle actually started at the Stone Bridge, which was on the far west of the Confederate lines. Beauregard, the general, thought that the Union would attack the center of his lines at Lewis Ford, and he fortified that place very strongly, and some other ones. But he didn't think that the Union would come at him from the side. McDowell saw the fords, saw the situation, and thought that he couldn't attack across these fords. He would lose most of his army. And so what he decided to do was to flank, to go around the side of the Southern Army and attack them. And so he sent one of his generals, Irvin, to Stone Bridge, and he was supposed to just look at the Confederate forces there and report back, but instead Irvin attacked Stone Bridge, and there was a sort of insubordinate skirmish at Stone Bridge. Actually, a moment on Irvin. Irvin is a really old general who was a real general. He was a general before McDowell became general, and he was very angry that McDowell had been promoted from major to general and put in charge of the whole army. This guy's 20 years older than McDowell is, with a lot more military service, and so he basically decided that he wasn't going to listen to anything that McDowell said, and he was going to do whatever he felt was right, which is not a very military attitude. But Irvin ended up attacking the Stone Bridge. There's this thing called the skirmish at Stone Bridge a few days before the battle started. He lost that, and then he sort of petulantly sat there and waited for McDowell to come down. And anyway, so I gotta get rid of this thing. There we go. Nope, still there. Oh well, we'll just leave it there. Life goes on. Here, we'll go with a picture of the battle here. So long story short, McDowell created this very complicated and tactically sound plan to flank the Confederate army. The problem was that his troops marched very slowly. They didn't do things very quickly at all. And then when they were supposed to march, Irvin put his army in front, even though he was supposed to be in back, because he felt like he was the most senior officer. And he should be in front of the marching orders, and he slowed down everything. And so an attack that was supposed to surprise the Confederates at 7 o'clock in the morning ended up finally getting across the river at Sudley Ford around, I don't know, 9 o'clock, 9:30 in the morning. By that time, the Confederates had seen them and had readjusted their army, and there was some stiff fighting on the flank of the Confederate army. Beauregard thought that he would attack the Northern Army, and so he sent out attack orders trying to attack the Northern Army from the eastern flank, but his couriers didn't deliver the orders, and they weren't put forth effectively, and so that attack didn't happen, which is actually lucky for the South, because if the attack had happened, they probably would have split their forces. So the battle takes place on Henry Hill primarily, and you can sort of see it there. It's the army of the Shenandoah, especially a guy named Thomas, who would become known as Stonewall Jackson, whose forces mostly fight up there. And it ends up being a Confederate victory. There's a lot of fighting over a couple of guns that McDowell ordered forward without adequate infantry support. Also, the Union infantry attacked a little bit at a time instead of massing into a giant line and attacking, and that caused problems. Additionally, Irvin's brigades attacked without telling McDowell that they were attacking, and so there was no coordination. And so the South was able to beat off these various bits and pieces one at a time instead of having to face them all at once. And ultimately, the Union cannot overcome that, and they're defeated and have to retreat. And so the combination of a number of factors caused the Union defeat. The most impactful officers in the battle were General Stonewall Jackson. We'll see him again. At the time, he was known as Thomas Jackson. He's actually an interesting guy. He was a real military general. He fought in the Mexican War as well, but he had given up being a general and become a teacher. He was teaching at VMI, Virginia Military Institute, and he was asked to rejoin the Army, and he did. And he went out in his blue uniform from his previous days and led his Virginia infantry up. And he did this tactic that really surprised the Union Army, the inexperienced Union Army. It was a tactic that he learned from studying Napoleon's battles, in particular a British officer by the name of the Duke of Wellington. One of the things they used to do was they would march up a hill, and right before they hit the top of the hill, they would stop right on the reverse slope of the hill, and they would lay down. And that's what he has his men do. He has his men lay down on the reverse slope of the hill. So the Union Army can't see them at all, but they're right over the top of the hill. And when the Union Army starts marching up the hill, he waits and he waits and he waits. And then his men spring up and just, shoot a pulverizing shot into the Union Army, and it forces the Union Army to retreat. And then his men took up position on the hill, and he held the hill against Union attacks. Remember, the attacks, though, were coming sort of from one unit at a time rather than all organized at once. But famously, General Bernard B. saw that Jackson's men were holding this hill and holding it so well, and he said, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall," right? And that's where Stonewall Jackson got his name. His men being in gray and forming a line and fighting on this hill were a stone wall, and so he was Stonewall Jackson from that point on. He also led a famous bayonet charge after shooting into the Union soldiers and forcing them to withdraw. Union guns were pounding his position, and so he charged the Union guns with bayonets and took them. And then most of the fighting in the Battle of Manassas took place over those guns subsequently. The most important general for the Union is actually a very negative thing. It's General Daniel Tyler, super insubordinate man, the guy who fought a battle at a ford when he didn't have to and was told not to, and then who got in line and held up the march because he felt like he should be first, and then who launched a number of his divisions at Jackson's men without telling McDowell and without having the proper support and coordination. Ultimately, a lot of his mistakes cost the Union, and maybe they were the decisive thing in the battle. It's hard to know. But you want soldiers who do what you tell them. So here are the factors in the battle before we call this video done. Lincoln's impatience. Lincoln couldn't wait and had to launch the attack. His army wasn't ready, and ultimately it paid the price. Patterson's failure. If Patterson had been able to keep Johnson's army in the Shenandoah, then McDowell would have outnumbered the Confederate Army, and Jackson wouldn't have been there, and it might have been a different situation. McDowell's inexperience. Remember, he was a major that was basically appointed to general and then had to lead this thing, and he'd never led this many troops before in his life, and that caused some problems. One of his issues was that he had this blunder with the guns. He ordered 2 regiments of artillery forward, unsupported by infantry, to attack the Confederate artillery, which is stupid in a couple of ways. First off, the Union artillery was rifled, and so they had a longer range than the Confederate artillery, and so they could shoot them from farther away. But he ordered them into short-range combat with the Confederate artillery, which meant they were both sort of equal. In fact, it was actually worse for the Union artillery, because the Confederate artillery, with their shorter range, had to sort of fire an upward arcing shot, sort of like I guess, a football pass that's a tight spiral versus one that goes way up and way down. The Confederate guns had to sort of lob their shells, and the Union shells would sort of spiral straight at the enemy. But there was a hill in between, and so the Confederate guns could actually be more effective firing over the hill than the Union guns, which were firing in a straight line. More information than you needed to know, probably, but I still think it's interesting. McDowell sends these guns unsupported by infantry forward, and then, of course, Jackson takes them. And so the Union doesn't have its advantage in artillery that it would have through most of the war, and that's one of the reasons that the battle's a failure as well. So McDowell didn't do a great job. But then there's Tyler and all of the things that he did wrong. And then there's the general lack of speed and discipline of the troops and the blackberry picking in the hot weather. And one of the long marches around the river, like the way that Beauregard had set up his troops is kind of intelligent because because of the way the river curved, it was a shorter distance for the South to get anywhere than it was for the North because they had to march around the whole curve, the outside curve of the river, where the South was on the inside curve of the river. So for every mile the South had to march to get to a battlefront, the North would have to march about 2. And so the North had to march about twice as long, and then they had to cross rivers and all of this kind of stuff. And it was a lot more difficult for them to get their troops into position than it was for the South, and the South just sort of had to wait. Then there's a uniform confusion, which also favored the South. There were 2 or 3 times during the battle when the North couldn't tell whether a unit that was approaching them was theirs or a Confederate unit, and so they held their fire, and then that unit ended up being Confederate and obliterating them. And so that caused a lot of confusion. A lot of these problems had to be handled and were starting to be handled immediately after this battle. The Union did a pretty good job of analyzing its defeat, figuring out what went wrong, and trying to rectify some of those problems. But all of those things contribute to the North's defeat. For the South, there were a couple of really good generals that did some really good things. First, you have Jeb Stuart, the cavalry commander, who was able to keep up that ruse that made Patterson think that Johnson's men were still in the Shenandoah when they were not. And so then there's the use of the telegraph and Johnson using the railroad to get his army faster than anybody anticipated over to Manassas and help with that battle. We also, the battle might have been fought a few days before Johnson could even get there had McDowell had adequate maps and known where to cross the river, but he had to scout the river and find out where to cross. And so that took him about 2 days. And that's about how long it took Johnson's men to get over to Manassas. So, that was a factor as well. Beauregard, however, despite the fact that he won this battle, was not a great general. He was incredibly proud and very aggressive, and he also anticipated what other people would do and could not fathom the idea that they wouldn't do what he thought. He thought McDowell was going to attack him in the center. He was ready for an attack on the center. He also thought Johnson was going to march to him instead of taking the railroad, and so he created a battle plan that depended on Johnson arriving at the rear of the Union army after it was already engaged. And when Johnson's army arrived, he didn't believe that it had actually arrived, and it took him a while to accept that fact. And so it was actually Johnston who was the premier general in this fight. He had more experience and a higher rank than Beauregard, and so he did most of the ordering that mattered. Beauregard created this plan for a counterattack that probably would have failed and only didn't occur because the men that he assigned to deliver the orders were not effective in their jobs. And so a lot of the failures on the southern side actually aided them in the battle, as opposed to the failures on the northern side, which failed them in the battle. And then, of course, we have Jackson's stand and his charge to capture the guns. And then Jeb Stuart's cavalry, after their ruse was discovered by Patterson after it was too late, they rode over to the battle, and they arrived, and they were able to make a charge, actually on the Zouaves that we mentioned earlier, and break them up. And so he had an important cavalry charge in the battle as well. He didn't kill a lot of guys, but he panicked the Union army and caused them to rout and fall back. So at the end of the battle, the Union army retreats over Bull Run and starts heading back to Washington. As you might imagine, Beauregard is keen to chase them down and inflict final defeat on them, but Patterson, to his credit, is able to bring his army over and threaten the South enough that the Confederate army couldn't follow up their victory by crushing the retreating Northern army. And that's how the Battle of Manassas ends. I'm going to do another video here in a little bit. I'd like to read you some personal journal entries and things like that from the battle, because I feel like they bring it to life. But this gives you an overview and gives you some idea of the tactics and some of the things that were going on in the first battle of the Civil War. And so when we go to Manassas battlefield and take a look, hopefully you can have a better image in your head of what went on. All right, thank you for your time.